Although other periods in American history have been significant, 1920 until 1930 was the most influential era due to the impactful events, people, and arts that helped drive the decade forward into the revolutionary and pioneering attitudes that are still seen in today's society.
The 1920s through 1930s can be looked at as a time of bliss and prosperity. However, for the African American community, it was a time of revolution. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural, social, and artistic revolution that took place in the 1920s. This movement is looked at to be the rebirth of African American art, as many different artists such as Langston Hughes, Paul Robeson, Zora Neale Hurston, and many more led the movement with their variety of artistic ability. The Harlem Renaissance was influential because it allowed blacks to show their true talents and display their strengths while simultaneously attempting to terminate stereotypes brought upon them by their white counterparts. The Harlem Renaissance was a way for African Americans to come together for one common cause.
Feminism was a huge movement during multiple eras, especially in the 1920s. It set the stage for a new women's youth culture, flappers. They were fashionable, easygoing, and enjoyed social settings previously male-controlled. The feminist aspect of the flappers was the idea that women were challenging social standards and normalities by listening to jazz, going to parties, and taking on other traditionally masculine behaviors. This paved the road for women to become more prominent in society in the years to come. Feminism also won the ratification of the 19th Amendment on August 18, 1920, which gave women their suffrage. This changed the course of women's history because they now had a new political strength that could be used to help the nation prosper. This was a huge victory on the behalf of women. These events involving feminism helped change and challenge the cult of domesticity as women were voicing their grievances and displeasure towards it through their behaviors.
During the 1920s, fundamentalist and modernist Christians clashed, changing the course of American religion. The modernists developed a liberal take on Christianity compatible with modern science. Fundamentalists opposed them, defending traditional beliefs. They aimed to purify society through movements such as prohibition and tried to ban public school teaching of evolution, which conflicted with their creationism beliefs. In the 1925 Scopes monkey trial of teacher John Scopes, who had taught a lesson on evolution in defiance of the Tennessee law, Scopes was found guilty, but the trial was a victory for modernists as they managed to discredit fundamentalists. Modernists were able to reshape Christianity to fit the changing times. The conflict contributed to increased secularism and the decline of traditional religion.
The St. Valentine's Massacre was a planned attack on a rival group of gangsters known as the Morans by Al Capone. The shooting was supposed to be quick and clean and easy, but that's not at all how things went. Furthermore, because of the brutality of Al Capone's men, the massacre instantly gained national spotlight and, more importantly, the police. The St. Valentine Massacre brought a new light of crime life to the public and brought reason for increased police funding and changed how police handled gang-related activities.
The 1920s were a very influential time period in American history and American literature because of the rising impact of music during the Jazz Age. At the peak of the 1920s, F. Scott Fitzgerald coined the term of the Jazz Age to describe the importance of different art forms in the 20s. Due to the rising economic power, many Americans were able to afford wants and needs, which, along with others, radios. The music of the Jazz Age was introduced to Americans because of the start of many large radio broadcasting systems in 1922. Americans could listen to what they wanted without ever leaving their homes. This musical impact led to the influence of dancing on Americans, led by African and European influence. One important person in the jazz world was Louis Armstrong, who was credited for putting jazz on the musical map. The musical influence of the 20s eventually led to bigger and better boosts in the music industry, and the jazz style of the music is still used today.
One thing unique about our time period is that the 1920s was also the start of true urbanization. Unfortunately, increased city life also gave birth to organized crime, and to be more specific, the rise of Al Capone. Al Capone's family started out in America in 1899, but at the height of Prohibition, Al Capone became a multi-millionaire gangster who made his wealth off prostitution, illegally distributing and selling alcohol, and gambling. Al Capone was soon arrested, but because of the lack of evidence for any criminal gangster crimes against Al Capone, the police used his tax evasions as a reason to send him to Alcatraz for 11 years and over $200,000 in back taxes. Even though Al Capone's crime spree had finally come to an end, his image and image of his men were immortalized in various films and books over the
Paul Robeson was born on April 9, 1898 in Princeton, New Jersey, and became a well-known athlete, singer, actor, and civil rights activist. Paul Robeson was the third African-American student to get a scholarship at Rutgers University and became one of the most stellar students. In 1920 to 1930, he also earned his law degree from Columbia University. In order to pay for his education, Robeson taught himself Latin and played football on the weekends. In 1924, Robeson published Body and Soul, one of his 11 films. Robeson came from a long line of strong and dedicated people, as his father was a runaway slave and his mother came from an abolitionist Quaker family. Therefore, working and paying for his own education came as no major challenge to him. Paul Robeson had such a powerful impact during the Harlem Renaissance, as he was a black man who accomplished so much. His ambition and drive led other African Americans to dream without limitations.
A prominent feminist during the 1920s was Carrie Chapman Catt. She was a firm believer in women's rights and total equality. She was educated at Iowa State University and aimed to gain equal rights for women, combat child labor, and enforce support for President Wilson's League of Nations to help create world peace. Kat influenced the outcome of the 19th Amendment because she founded the National American Women's Suffrage Association. This helped the campaign for the 19th Amendment gain momentum. After women won their suffrage, some were unsure on how to vote or afraid to do so. Therefore, Kat created the League of Women Voters to help women carry out responsibilities of voting. This was a huge success and it is still around today.
The 1920s also saw the rise of birth control activist Margaret Sanger. Sanger founded the American Birth Control League in 1921, trying to make safe, effective contraception legal and accessible to American women to prevent unwanted pregnancies. She challenged the Comstock laws, which banned the distribution of contraceptives or information about them. Due to her persistent actions, the conservative stance of the country began to shift. Sanger helped to get popular support for birth control, giving women more control over reproduction. Birth control has significantly decreased unwanted pregnancies and back alley abortions, saving many lives, and is now easily obtainable in the U.S. due to the first steps taken by Margaret Sanger in the 1920s.
Literature in this time period was used to directly tell audience what was wrong with society and give them ideas on how to fix it. Sinclair Lewis uses many examples of detail, satire, and realism to form vivid scenes of American economy, most importantly the middle class. Through many different writings, including Babbitt, Arrowsmith, and Elmer Gantry, he reveals to Americans their lives at a time when they were ready to listen. Due to the impact of the economic rise and fall, he's able to appeal to consumerism and conformity through symbolism and realism. His book, It Can't Happen Here, is a prime example of a warning against the growth of fascism in America. Lewis also wrote much smaller novels, such as The Man Who Knew Coolidge, which often uses the American voice of a businessman using satire. These writings swayed readers towards the reality of the time and changed the era.
Rights. Jailed for Freedom, her book, was a first-hand record of the campaign for women's suffrage. It explains the stories of women picketing around government stations and how they were attacked and put in prison. Stevens' intended purpose was to show the fight of women and the reality of the campaign. This was very influential because it is seen as a piece of history of the National Women's Party and the truth behind the government's actions against the women during this era. This opened the eyes of America and opened the gates for women to prosper in the nation.
Along with important authors of the 1920s, literature alone was impactful to the morale of the American people. A Farewell to Arms, written by Ernest Hemingway, takes place from 1916 to 18 and honestly depicts life during the war times without glorifying it. In this time period, many attempted to blend fact with fiction of the war and attempted to dull the effects and cause more people to join the military to fight for their country. Hemingway was a medic during World War I, and A Farewell to Arms was his honest depiction of how he saw the war and fell in love. Although he wrote many other books about the time period, this was the most influential because it contained no fluff about the war and told the American people that although they had the perfect life now, it was because of the ugly war that had recently ended.
T.S. Eliot, who wrote many major poems during the 1920s, has been one of America's most influential writers. Eliot's poems, primarily The Wasteland in 1922, marked the beginning of modernist literature. Eliot influenced essentially all subsequent poets through his pioneering of a new style of literature. The Wasteland is highly elusive, with many references to and quotations from Dante, Walt Whitman, and others. It depicts a crumbling wasteland and suffering people, and is an extended metaphor for the decay and bleakness of the modern world. Its dark subject matter, fragmented structure, diverse forms of verse, and themes of chaos and doubt in humanity are characteristic of the modernism to which Eliot contributed so much.
Philosophical modernist poet named Wallace Stevens, who published his first book in 1923. Unlike most poets of the time who challenged American culture and the dream, Wallace challenged reality itself and what it means to exist in the famous poem The Snowman. The Snowman is about Wallace projecting his emotions on his surroundings and his life, which in turn creates his point of view and his reality. Wallace is also trying to explain that misery will only change your outlook on life in a negative way. He does this by using winter as an example because most people view it as dark and gloomy. This piece of literature is important because it offered readers a chance to question their whole outlook on life. The Snowman by Wallace Stevens offers insight that many hope to gain in their lifetime and still applies today.
Langston Hughes was born on February 1st, 1902 in Joplin, Missouri. Hughes was one of the most influential figures during the Harlem Renaissance as his poetry, novels, plays, and social activism led the movement to be so successful. Throughout his life, Hughes has written over 35 different pieces of literature ranging from over 5 different styles. One of Hughes' most famous pieces is his short story, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. It depicts the life of a young African-American poet who who desires to write as a white poet, so his work can be taken seriously. Hughes then goes on to say how it is a disgrace that Negro artists feel as though they are forced to be something they are not in order to be accepted. In the end, Hughes expresses how young Negro artists must learn to accept themselves and be proud of their heritage, and how despite those who do not like Negro work, regardless of race, young Negro writers should continue to write.
Although other periods in American history have been significant, 1920 to 30 was the most influential era due to the impactful events, people, and arts that helped drive the decade forward into the revolutionary and pioneering attitudes